as you've all been sent the agenda, and you see it's quite packed. We have got a 5-minute break at about 5:15, but I'd like to now move on to introduce one of our key speakers, if not our key speaker, Lord Goldsmith, who's been a committed environmentalist, I would say, for most of his life, and is editor of The Ecologist magazine as well. And he's been a member of Parliament for a decade as a government minister, and is now obviously in the UK House of Lords. So he's got a tremendous amount of experience in the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office, and also for the Department of Environment. And his background's really interesting, and it reflects his passion, I think, too, with the responsibility that he's had as minister over forests and oceans and biodiversity, which is gaining more and more momentum in all sorts of things that we do at local authority levels, but also increasingly aware of what we do all of the time with regards to across Essex. And of course, this is all about climate change, but it's not climate change as we are just focusing on Essex, but it's also about Lord Goldsmith's experience goes across Pacific regions and overseas territories. And of course, he's been really involved with the COPs frameworking as well, and lots of work on the ocean. So as you can tell, just from what I'm saying, that with his experience and knowledge, he is going to give us a insight into what not only is he's passionate about, but the knowledge and what we can do to help move our Essex Schools Climate Action Network. And you, as all ambassadors arriving today at our first meeting, I'm sure you will find this really interesting and helpful, because this is all part and parcel about bringing us all together and sharing ideas. And it's those sharing of the ideas that we can develop and make changes. So this is our first online meeting, as I said earlier, and I'm very pleased to welcome Lord Goldsmith. So Zach, I'm very pleased to warmly welcome you to this event, and looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Councillor. Thank you, Maddie, for organising, and congrats to everyone for putting on, well, creating this network, which is much needed, really across the world. We need many such networks. So I know the context for this session is climate change, but with your permission, I'm going to broaden it, because one of the concerns that I have, and I've seen this throughout the sort of political world that I've lived in, and even within some environmental groups, is that the focus, when we talk about the environment, we have reduced that gigantic, multidimensional, incredibly complex thing on which all life depends down to this very, very narrow focus on carbon and climate change. And the reality is that, just from a practical point of view, there is no pathway to net zero. There is no solution to climate change that doesn't involve massive efforts to restore, protect nature, really on an unprecedented scale. You will know that logically. I think anyone who really is interested in this issue knows that the forests absorb carbon, the mangroves even more so, but they do so much more than that. And yet we are destroying ecosystems around the world at a really staggering rate, even while we can see we're making some progress in relation to the low carbon transition, clean energy, and so on. The number of species now on the brink of extinction or facing possible extinction is not far off 1 million, according to the IUCN. We know that around 40% of plant species today are facing possible extinction. We know that we're hoovering life out of the world's ocean just as quickly as we're pouring trash back into the ocean. We're told that by the end of this decade, there's going to be more plastic in the ocean than fish if you measure it by weight. And if I speak to you now for, I guess, 10 minutes before we get to the Q&A, and if trends are as per normal for today, we will have lost around 300 football pitches worth of tropical rainforest by the time that I finish. Now, it's almost impossible to imagine what that really means. These figures are just so huge, but the rate at which we're converting ecosystems is really horrifying. And the implications are equally horrifying, not just for climate change, but for really everything we know. When you convert complex ecological systems, you not only lose irreplaceable biodiversity, which we're doing at an extraordinary rate, you lose those free but critically important systems, those services that ecosystems provide. I'll give you an example of that. I had the privilege of being able to spend some time in the Congo Basin when I was a minister in the Foreign Office, and trying to figure out how can we support those countries to protect rather than erode their forests. And it's believed, no one ever knows for sure, because there is no computer model on Earth which is capable of really taking into account the full complexity of nature. But it is believed that the Congo Basin generates over half of the rainfall for the entire continent of Africa. And if you look at the Amazon, it's a similar story over there. So when you lose those forests, which is happening, 1 million hectares a year in the case of the Congo, you're not just losing biodiversity, you're not just losing nature, trees, things that I think most people don't just on an emotional level want to lose. You're actually catapulting our species towards a humanitarian crisis, the likes of which you've never seen before. Obviously, there is no agriculture in the continent of Africa without rainfall. And if what scientists believe is true, then we face a future where rainfall becomes even more scarce in a part of the world where they really can't afford that. We are similarly fish stocks. We believe that of the world's 17 great fisheries, 15 have now been brought either to the point of exhaustion, i.e. they no longer are fisheries, they're dead zones, or to the brink of exhaustion. And if you consider that 250 million people in the world depend on fishing just for their livelihoods, around 1 billion people depend on fish as their main source of protein. I mean, you don't need to be a geologist or an anthropologist or a mathematician to know where trends are heading. We're facing real shortages, real problems in the future. And the reason I say this, and I obviously we could devote the entire session talking about the bad news. I'm not going to do that, don't worry. But the reason I say this is because when we reduce the environment as a cause down to just carbon, we lose sight of the big picture. And that is unfortunately what we've done. Only a fraction of public aid money, for example, is invested in climate change. Only a fraction of philanthropic money is invested in tackling climate change. But even of that tiny fraction, an even tinier fraction is devoted to environmental solutions, despite the fact that protecting, restoring forests, mangroves, even other key ecological systems is by far the most cost-effective solution to climate change. So my focus, my obsession, really, as far back as I remember, is trying to shift that focus as much as possible to the natural world, not just looking down this very narrow, one-dimensional tunnel of carbon reduction. Because if we can reconcile our society, our economy, our culture, our way of life with the natural world, in the process of doing that, we will be tackling climate change. But climate change is just one of the symptoms of a dysfunctional relationship we have with the natural world. It's an appalling and frightening symptom, but it's just one symptom. The problem, if you like, climate change is the fever that the Earth is experiencing as a consequence of our abusive relationship with the natural world. And that is the bit that we have to fix. And if we don't, well, then we are going to be in trouble. And we tried, the UK, to broaden the focus. You'll remember, I think, that we hosted the Climate COP in Glasgow 3 years ago, I've lost track of time. The Glasgow COP was described at the time as a sort of nature COP. I don't think it was fully a nature COP, but it was much more so than any previous COP. And we had persuaded the leaders of 145 countries representing about 90% of the world's forests to commit to ending and reversing deforestation this decade. We secured commitments of around $20 billion to help those nature-rich but economically less rich countries to do so. And we persuaded the multilateral development agencies like the World Bank to align their portfolios with that same goal. It was called the Glasgow Leaders Declaration. We worked very closely with other countries in the year between the climate COP and the biodiversity COP that happened a year later in Montreal, where it was agreed that the world would protect 30% of the world's ocean and 30% of the world's land. It was called the Global Biodiversity Framework, or the Kunming-Montreal framework. The reality is that today, if you look at all the agreements that have happened over the last few years, the treaties, the targets, the commitments that countries have signed up to, it's pretty much all there. We got the Paris Agreement on climate, we got the Glasgow Agreement on forests, we got the Montreal Kunming Protocol 30 by 30 I just mentioned, we got the High Seas Treaty, which is going to allow us to create protected areas in areas beyond national jurisdiction in the world's oceans. The infrastructure from a policy point of view is pretty much there. The bit that's missing is the most important bit, and that is the action. So it's one thing signing up and agreeing to these targets, it's another thing meeting them. And countries around the world are scratching their heads and figuring out how they're going to do this. And I think a lot of people, just people who have an interest in these issues, are looking at those targets and thinking, how on earth are we going to do it? How do we get to net zero? How do we protect 30% of the world's ocean, 30% of the world's land? How do we reverse this catastrophic loss in biodiversity that we've been seeing over the last few decades? And it's often put forward as a kind of trade-off. You can either have prosperity or you can have the environment. You can have economic growth or the environment. You can't have both. And that's simply not true. And for me, this is the good news. And whenever I find myself overwhelmed by the bad news, and there's plenty of it out there, unfortunately, I remind myself that all around the world, there are examples of communities, regions, even whole countries turning the tide and doing so in a way that has been good for the people as well. And there are examples really everywhere. I've just come back from Indonesia, which is a country that for many years was regarded as a kind of real bad actor when it comes to environmental destruction. We all know about palm oil, rampant deforestation of some extraordinary habitats. But Indonesia has quietly, and without really any credit at all, and I think it should get credit, has broken the link between palm oil production and forests. So palm oil no longer contributes, other than on a very small scale, to deforestation in Indonesia. The pulp and paper sector, which was the biggest cause of deforestation in Indonesia, also no longer contributes to deforestation, and yet both those sectors continue to grow, and they're becoming more efficient. They're using land which was abandoned, degraded, and been regenerated. The point is that economy, that extraordinarily important part of Indonesia's economy, continues to flourish, but not at the expense of the natural world. Or in the Maldives, a country who a significant proportion of Maldivian income, the GDP, comes from the tuna industry. But in the Maldives, unlike any other country on earth, it is illegal to trawl. It is illegal to use long lines with multiple hooks. It's one line, one hook. And they've done this partly to conserve tuna and the value of tuna, but secondly, they've done it in order to create jobs. So there are more people employed per capita in the fish sector in the Maldives than any of the neighboring countries, but it's about the only place with a sustainable number of tuna. They've got the balance right. You've got Gabon, which is about 90%, 88% forest still. In the last 15 years, the value of logging to Gabon has almost trebled. So 3 times more income from logging ancient trees than 15 years ago. But the number of trees being logged has reduced almost by the same proportion. It is now illegal if you're in Gabon to sell raw timber. You have to process it. You have to turn it into something before it can be exported. So the number of people employed has multiplied. The amount of money being brought into the economy has multiplied. And yet there is no net deforestation at all now in Gabon. You're allowed to take 1 tree per hectare. It's actually 2 trees per 3 hectares every 25 years. It is sustainable. You can buy timber from Gabon and be part of the solution, not the problem. And so there are many other examples, and I'm probably running out of time. But the point I'm making is that each of the problems that we face environmentally, there are solutions. We don't have to invent new solutions. They're already there. They're just not all happening under one umbrella. But there's nothing that needs to be done that is not already being done somewhere by governments or by communities or by regions or corporations. It is happening. Our job is to try and find the levers we need in order to turn those examples of best practice, the exceptional best practice, into the norm, into the default. And that's, I think, where governments come in. And there is really an important role for government when it comes to regulation. We've not been good at this here or in most countries of the world. There are examples where a law has changed and we've seen behavior change as a result. We introduced in this country decades ago the landfill tax. For the first time, waste became a financial liability. Companies realized that if they didn't do something, their tax was going to go up and up and up, and they were going to become unprofitable. So they had to start minimizing the waste they produced just to avoid that landfill tax. It was meant to continue escalating the tax until we reached something approaching a zero waste society, but it stopped. It was frozen and it never continued to grow. But initially, we could see that by turning waste into a liability, waste was minimized. And that is, I think, the biggest challenge. How do you turn waste and the use of scarce resources into an active liability? How do we train the economy? If it were an animal, how would you train it to recognize the value in valuable things? Today, a forest is worth more when you cut it down than when it's alive. The Amazon, without it, there's probably not much of a future on Earth for any of us. And yet it's not worth anything in conventional economic terms until it's been cut down and converted into something like toilet paper or packaging. So how do we
Lord Goldsmith, would you mind wrapping up, because we're a bit concerned about time going past so quickly. It's fascinating as what you're talking about. Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna stop there because there are many examples. I make one final point, if I could, is that it is a huge challenge we face, but we know that we can respond if we took this challenge seriously. If we recognized collectively that ultimately we have to reconcile ourselves with the natural world, or there will be no future, we know that we could take the proportionate action. We were willing to close down the entire global economy over COVID. If there was a security threat that this country faced, we'd be willing to throw billions, tens of billions, possibly hundreds of billions at it. At the moment, we're tinkering around the edges on the environment, and ultimately, and I hope it doesn't come to this generation. I remember when I was younger being told it's going to be your generation. We have to respond in kind. We have to allow that recognition to shape the way we make decisions and react to what is undoubtedly a very serious crisis. I'm so sorry for speaking so long. I had intended to speak much less, but I got carried away with my example. So I'm going to stop there.
No, thank you very much. Well, no, it's really fascinating and it makes very interesting listening to, I can tell you. And I'm just a bit concerned about your time, because I presume you'll be leaving us fairly shortly. So if we have got time for a couple of very quick Q&As,
Sure.
and if there are any further left over, we'll try, if everybody could put them into the chat, and Maddie will then ask them, and then, but we'll have to move on quickly to our next speaker anyway, but we will try and respond to those questions as well. So Maddie, over to you if there's a couple of questions there for Lord Goldsmith.
Yes, thank you for that really interesting talk, Lord Goldsmith. That was fascinating. We have a couple of questions, and I'll pick one of them's got a few thumbs up. So the first question is, what can we do as young people to impact the environment in a positive way?
So, I mean, I'm going to have to give you the obvious answer for me, and that is politics. You don't have to be an elected politician. You don't even have to stand for election, but be political. Every one of us, if you care about anything, you're political. If you sign a petition, it's political. And we do need political change. The big corporates are not going to change their behavior unless they're told to. It's just not going to happen. They're not going to avoid pollution unless pollution becomes a liability. Politicians have the ability to write the rules, and it is essential that they feel pressure from people, an expectation from people that they will do so. You know, we worked incredibly hard to put a 10p charge on plastic bags. It was a tiny step in the right direction, but really we need to find create a regulatory environment in which the use of single-use plastics is just no longer viable. Politicians really do need or legislators need to absolutely get on board and behave as if this were a genuine crisis, but that only comes from pressure. So be political, and that would be my advice.
Fantastic. And then the next question is, how is climate change most affecting global economies?
That's a really interesting point. I mean, there are two ways. One is in a very positive way, and that is that the transition to a cleaner economy, it's the biggest economic transition that we've ever had. It's huge. To go from near total dependence on polluting fossil fuels to clean energy alternatives has created huge opportunities. So more money last year globally was invested in clean technology, clean energy technology, than in fossil fuels. The same with the year before and the year before that. And that gap is widening. So huge opportunities in this transition. You can't have a transition of that sort without massive opportunities for entrepreneurs, for young people learning new skills, etc. But on the other level, I don't think we have yet fully understood the magnitude of the environmental threat we're facing here in the UK. Colombia, other countries experience extreme weather events much more frequently than we do, and they do feel the cost. So currently in Colombia, they're replanting the entire Caribbean coast with mangroves. They're not doing it for biodiversity. They're not doing it for nature or even for climate change. They're doing it because they recognize that with increasing storm surges, they need the protection that mangroves offer. So this has now become an insurance policy. There are many, many other examples like that, but I won't go down the rabbit hole of repeating them all to you now. But we are so dependent on the services that nature provides. As those services, as those systems break down, and they are breaking down, there are many, many repercussions. So it really, I don't even think we've begun to feel the full impacts of climatic instability and environmental degradation, but we will.
Fantastic. And then one final question is, how are our negative contributions to the environment impacting the decline of certain species?
Very, very much so. I mean, we have I was just talking to one of the campaigners who campaigns for cavity nesting birds just earlier today, and she tells me that there's been a 20% decline in swifts in the last 18 months. So we're seeing a catastrophic collapse in biodiversity all around the world, not just the megafauna, the charismatic creatures that we all grew up looking in cartoon books and fantasizing about, but across the board, the insect world, the pollinators, the plants that perhaps we've never even come across. We're seeing a generalized collapse in biodiversity. And this is not something that's for debate. I mean, it is an observed fact. And we know that where, of course, it's incredibly valuable to focus on individual species reintroductions, because that can have a huge impact. The beaver being introduced into the UK by people who just did it. They're probably doing it against the law, but they did it. As a consequence, we're seeing a massive increase in amphibian life in areas where the beavers have been reintroduced. They just create this kind of explosion of biological activity. So that stuff is very, very good. But ultimately, we have to protect ecosystems, because without ecosystems, without habitat, we lose even more biodiversity.
Okay, thank you, Lord Goldsmith. I mean, that was very, very interesting. And just for your information, you'll be delighted to know that actually we have got beavers at Finchingfield in Essex, all through our climate action work here at Essex County Council and through the Commission as well. So it's really good news. And you're quite right what you say. Anyway, I'd like to thank you very much for that, because I think you've just opened this brilliantly and given us a real global perspective of the interaction of how important the environment is to all of us in every way.
Well, thank you very much. And as I think Maddie said, or maybe you said, if anyone wants to follow up with questions, I'm very easy to contact. Thank you all so much.
Thank you very much. We'll do that. Okay, thank you
very
again.
much.
All right,
thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Quickly following on from that, and a little bit behind time, but we'll try and claw some back. I'd like to now introduce Prajwal Pandey, who's the young co-chair of the Essex Climate Action Commission. And Praj has been a passionate advocate for climate action and sustainability, and obviously with his youth and dynamics perspective, he's on the Commissioner's work. It's great that he's been involved with all of this. And he's been instrumental in helping shaping the policies, not only about the carbon emissions and promoting renewable energy, but he's also been involved with that commission and helped shape those recommendations that we at Essex County Council adopted a couple of years ago now and have been working on. So we're very lucky to have Praj today to share his insights and experience of what he feels about climate action, and I welcome him to this first meeting, and I'm sure you'll find him very interesting. So Praj.
Thank you, Councillor Shreer, and thank you all for joining. It's great to see so many of you here today. I think he's dropped off now, but I'd also like to thank Lord Goldsmith and Amanda, our guest speakers for tonight, for taking time out of their day to support our initiative. So as Councillor Shreer touched upon, my background is I am one of two young co-chairs of the Essex Climate Action Commission. My primary role on the commission has been to champion the interests of young people. So of course, just onto the next slide, if we could. Thank you. We're all gathered here today for the launch of the Essex Schools Climate Action Network, which will be a network of young people in schools across Essex for the purposes of climate action. This, of course, raises the question of, well, why establish a network? What is the value in doing so? Well, of course, we all know climate change impacts young people the most, in that this will be the environment which we will be inheriting. And we can see that young people recognise this and are very passionate about climate action. I've pasted here a picture from the climate strikes from 2019 in Chelmsford, right in the heart of Essex. So clearly we can see that young people are very keen on this topic. However, an issue which I've seen myself personally is that many young people lack the resources or knowledge to be able to effectuate change. So therefore, by creating a network, we increase the scope and effectiveness of our efforts. We make it easier for young people to learn through discussion, through talks such as the one done by Lord Goldsmith just before me, and then implement this, their gained knowledge in their schools and local communities. And of course, there is strength in numbers. By creating a network of young people, we enable collective action rather than individual action in schools across the county. And finally, a final benefit would be more young people wanting to join in. As young people see their peers joining in climate action, they themselves will perhaps get some motivation to join in too. So just onto the next slide, please. So I just thought I'd bring in a case study as to potential action that the network could undertake. So for example, the King John School in Bentley established a community-led Facebook group for swapping, selling and giving away school uniform, thereby reducing waste. And as you can see here, it is quite large with over 800 members currently. So I just thought I'd bring up this example just to show that imagine if such initiatives were implemented by young people across Essex. It would be great for example, the King John School to present to the network and then inspire more young people to go on to initiate such initiatives in their own respective schools. So this is just to demonstrate the sheer strength in numbers that can be created from the network. So of course, just onto the next slide, please. What could this network look like? Now, when I first brought this idea to the Commission, then there was one thing which I was very keen on, and that was making the network completely youth-led. I think that in order to truly foster a culture of stewardship towards the environment in young people, the only solution is for this network to be led by young people and for young people. Nonetheless, in the past year, we've undertaken various partnerships. So for example, we partnered with Design Differently to research young people across Essex and what their attitudes would be towards a potential network. So our surveys so far indicate at least one virtual meeting per half term, thereby making it very accessible to young people. They can join virtually in meetings such as these. And perhaps in these meetings, we would have schools presenting their own projects, which they've implemented in schools. For example, I touched on the King John School earlier. This can then spur discussion and be a source for inspiration for young people to go on to implement their own projects in their own schools. And of course, we can have general discussion like we just have had with Lord Goldsmith and various other guest speakers. So the opportunities for this network are endless, and I have a bar chart here just to demonstrate the potential that the network has. As you can see here, 50% of young people aged 18 to 24 in Essex do not feel informed about how they can help reduce climate change. And of course, this is the largest of any of the given age groups. And I think that by creating a network and creating discussion, enabling the diffusion of knowledge, we can reverse this trend and we can see more young people confident in the fight against climate change. And just a final suggestion on various themes which we could cover. So in our discussions which we had in our various surveys, we saw restoring nature, which was a key theme in Lord Goldsmith's speech, working within schools, developing green skills, and incentivizing circular communities as key topics which could be covered in the network. But ultimately, as I said before, it's completely up to young people how they wish this network to look like. And I'm very glad to be presenting this initiative with you today, and I am very excited to see where it can go in the future. I'll pass on back to Councillor Shreer, but thank you very much for your attendance here today.
Thank you very much, Praj. That was really good to see how you evolved at that. I'm slightly aware of time too, and the fact that we're a little bit behind schedule, because I know Maddie will be pointing a finger at me saying you're not keeping to time. So moving on. Could I do notice that in the agenda, we've just got a 5-minute break a little bit later. I just think because of the time, and we're only going to 6, would everybody be content not to have that 5-minute break, or is it desperate? If you just put an answers in the chat, because I think it's such interesting stuff, we could easily carry on to 6 and try and finish by then rather than stopping for 5 minutes. I'm a bit concerned we won't all be back in our seats quite so quickly. So thank you very much for that, Praj. That was really good. If anybody's got any Q&As on that, if you put them into the chat, we'll get them answered, that's for sure, at some time. So Maddie, I'll hand over to you now because you want to do a quick group discussion.
Yes, thank you, Councillor Shreer. And yeah, I'd just like to extend my thanks to Praj for your presentation just then, and also to Lord Goldsmith for his fantastic talk as well.
And it's really interesting that we've been mentioning so much about the services that nature provides. And I think this is going to be fascinating. And Amanda's had a successful TV commercial production, which has been involved with climate change through reforestation under her leadership, Just One Tree, and has planted 1 million trees. Worldwide, that is. I'm fascinated because at Essex, the Essex Forest Initiative, I thought we've done well by planting 407,000 trees in the last 4 years. But I'm really interested to hear this. So, Amanda, I'm sure we all are going to be really interested to see how you've done and what you've done with getting 1 million trees planted globally. Thank you.
Actually, it's a lot more than that now, so you'll have to wait till the end to find out how many we're now at. Is it okay to change to the first slide? Thanks. So, hi everyone, my name is Amanda and I'm the CEO and founder of Just One Tree. Thank you so much for having me come in and be invited to talking today. So I don't know about you, but I really enjoyed having a bit of a break over the summer. Although it is all too easy for people to push the idea of climate change completely out of their minds whilst enjoying their holidays. So I'm really, really pleased to see so many people here today, because the reality is we are still very much on a swift and unsettling pathway to an unlivable planet. And let's face it, that's a pretty scary thought. And I wonder how many of us at times feel overwhelmed by the enormity of it all, or how many of us have asked the questions, what can I do about it? Or will anything I do even begin to make an impact? Or could my school be doing more? Well, what if I told you that there is a way that both you and your school could have a huge impact on climate change? And what's more, hundreds of schools are doing it already, and many in Essex. But first, I want to start off by telling you a story. Because the truth is, in 2019, I felt overwhelmed. At the time, I was a producer in TV commercials, and my daughter Senna was just 2 years old when all of a sudden climate change hit the news headlines with a real bang. Next slide, please. All the press and Greta started talking about was how little time left we had before we set off these irreversible tipping points, just 10 years in fact, that would lead to the end of our civilization as we know it. I found myself looking at my then 2-year-old daughter and feeling terrified. What on earth had I done bringing her into this world? In 10 years' time, she would only be 12. What would life be like for her when she was 40 or 60? What on earth had I done? But I didn't know what I could do about it because I already recycled everything. We didn't drive very much. I didn't eat much meat. And at the time, the governments weren't even acknowledging we were in a climate emergency. I felt absolutely terrified and I began to panic. But that panic soon turned into drive and determination. Now, as we all know, to limit the effects of climate change, we need to drastically reduce our carbon emissions. But scientific evidence tells us that this alone is not enough. Next slide, please. To stop our planet exceeding 1.5 to 2 degrees of global warming, we actually need to reach something called net negative emissions. And that's where we're pulling more carbon out the atmosphere than we're putting into it. So net zero is not enough because there's too much carbon out there already. But how can just one individual, a mum from High Barnet, possibly go about doing that and possibly even begin to make an impact? Well, there is a magic machine that costs very little and builds itself and sucks carbon out the atmosphere. And it's called a tree. Next slide, please. Now, trees do so much more for us than just being carbon sinks. They help form the very complex ecosystems our survival depends on. They clean the air we breathe. They filter the water we drink. They provide homes for the world's wildlife. They prevent soil erosion and flooding and provide protection against extreme weather. And they give jobs to 1.6 billion people. Pretty impressive. And we need trees more than we realise, because the other not so talked about crisis in the room is biodiversity loss. And with biodiversity loss comes complete ecosystem collapse. In other words, the collapse of our planet. And to put that into context, we're losing species faster today than we did in the run-up to any of the previous mass extinctions that have struck our planet. So pretty scary. So when I discovered how cheap it was to plant a tree, I couldn't help but think, well, I'd plant a tree for my daughter's future. And I'm pretty sure that other parents would do too if they thought it was just £1. So I looked it up. Next slide, please. And did you know there are over 10 million children in education in the UK alone? Can you imagine the impact if a tree was planted for each and every one of them? Next slide, please. And with 5.9 million businesses in the private sector, what if a tree was planted with every property sold, or every insurance policy, or every meal out? Individually, just £1 is such a small amount, but collectively, it would really quickly add up. We could be the ones driving change and having an incredible impact on the climate crisis. So going back to the question, how does just one individual possibly go about making a difference? I quickly realised it's when we individuals join together. And that's when I set up Just One Tree. Next slide, please. So Just One Tree is a non-profit organisation tackling the dual crisis of climate change and biodiversity loss through global reforestation. And we make it simple because just £1 plants one tree. And we provide a platform where individuals, schools and businesses can all come together and take collective action. Next slide, please. And we plant our trees where they're needed the most. We concentrate on mass areas of deforestation and we plant them across South America, Asia and Africa, where they'll have the biggest positive effect on limiting global warming. Next slide, please. And in the process, we're actually helping to alleviate extreme poverty within the local communities by providing agricultural education and sustainable incomes. And in doing so, we're actually preventing further deforestation by cutting that cycle and turning the local communities into forest caretakers. And of course, we're providing homes for amazing wildlife species like lemurs in Madagascar, one-horned rhinos in Nepal, and elephants in Mozambique. Now, Just One Tree isn't just a reforestation organisation. We actually have 3 core pillars we focus on. The first is restoration on land. The second is restoration in the oceans. Next slide, please. And because climate change isn't just limited to within our shorelines, we wanted to address the issues our oceans are facing, such as ocean acidification, rising sea temperatures, and marine biodiversity loss. And we do that through 2 separate avenues. The first is through kelp regeneration, seaweed, basically, off the coast of the Philippines and Australia. And 3 pence from every pound raised automatically supports this project. Next slide, please. And the second avenue is by planting mangroves. As Lord Goldsmith mentioned earlier, mangroves are really, really important. In fact, both kelp and mangroves are the powerhouses of carbon absorption, whilst being really vital to marine ecosystems. So, for example, mangroves can absorb up to 10 times more carbon per hectare compared to land-based trees. And they provide a breeding ground for 3/4 of the world's tropical fish species. Now, that's first pillar is restoration on land, the second is oceans, and the third is environmental education. So we believe that the next generations are key to a sustainable future. Next slide, please. So going back to those 10 million children in education, what if a tree was planted for every single one of them? But how do we go about achieving that? Well, what if there was a day that united schools up and down the UK with schools around the world? And on that day, and it was a day of climate action, and on that day, the teachers got free teaching resources to use in their classrooms. And with 73% of children suffering from eco or climate anxiety, what if that day made them feel empowered through positive action? Well, that's just what the Just One Tree Day does. It's a yearly non-uniform or wear something green or only wear secondhand or any type of fundraising event you want it to be. But it's a yearly event which unites children, teachers and schools around the world in a day to reforest the planet. Next slide, please. And on that day, for every pound that's raised, a tree is planted. And of course, we provide the free educational resources. But on that day, for every pound that's raised, a tree is planted for the children and their future. And they get to see how their individual actions really do add up. So they get to watch how their one tree means their school plants an entire forest. And when you multiply that by all the schools taking part, and while so far the children have funded the planting of over 330,000 trees, can you imagine walking through a forest of that size? That's 158 acres. And we actually track the amount of trees that your school plants, and we update you with the growing size of your forest and the CO2 your forest will absorb every time you take part. Next slide, please. Now, Just One Tree is 5 years old, and we've gone from the spark of an idea in my lounge to being a multi-award-winning organisation planting 4 million trees around the world and providing over 48,500 days of rural employment. Over 1,000 schools and businesses have now partnered with us to plant trees as part of their sustainability strategies, and over 220,000 children have taken part in Just One Tree Day. We also gained global recognition when the United Nations invited us to be a partner in their decade on ecosystem restoration. Now, I've got a little film for you. We put it together about 9 months ago when we passed the 3.5 million trees planted mark. And it's a little thank you to our donors. But I really wanted to play it to you today just because it really does bring it all to life. And I hope that it works okay over Teams.
So I've popped it at the end of the presentation. Is that okay if I just skip to that?
Yep, sure. Great, thank you. And actually, if you could just go to this one slide above this, that'd be great. Brilliant. So if you want your school to be doing more, or if you want to make a difference, but you're not sure where to start, I ask you to join us and the other schools that take part in Just One Tree Day, so that together we can make a big impact on climate change. The next date for Just One Tree Day is October the 18th. There's still plenty of time to sign up and get involved, or you can actually take part any time of year throughout whichever date that suits your school calendar. To find out more, head to justonetree.life, or you can scan that QR code, which takes you to our website. Thank you so much for listening and for having me here today.
Thank you very much, Amanda.